So I think it'll be helpful just to talk about the context a little bit, so we can understand the contribution that VR is making in this area. So genomics is basically another word for all of a person's genes and how those genes interact with the environment. And we can think of genomics, or at least genomics as it pertains to common health conditions, conditions like diabetes, obesity, heart disease, and so on. We can think of that as actually kind of an emerging technology, not too different from XR in some ways. And so use of genomics is increasing on a lot of fronts. As the science matures, so too is the use of genomics in the clinic and also in communities as well. So just as a few examples I have here on the slide, there's growing use of online genetic testing kits where people can learn about their disease risk, their ancestry, so on. There are lots of companies springing up offering to help you use this genetic data to optimize your diet or other aspects of your life. A little bit of buyer beware there, but definitely these things are on the rise. And then there's also sort of government and academic and industry efforts that are underway to try and accelerate the research and make genomics actually more useful to clinicians and to consumers. And so really ultimately our goal here is to translate the scientific knowledge that's starting to come out of the labs and make genomics into a usable clinical and public health tool. So we want to be able to use people's genetic information to do things like make personalized recommendations for treatments and prevention and so on. But as I said, the science to do this isn't quite ready yet. However, when it does happen, the one thing that's really interesting about genetics and genomics is a little bit different from some of the other healthcare arenas we might be more used to, is that those advances, they tend to get translated really quickly. So, new genomic advances happen in the lab, and then suddenly they're sort of in the clinical realm, they're in the consumer realm especially. And so, often this happens too quickly for us to figure out whether certain genomic tools might have ripple effects for patients or ripple effects for society. And it often also happens too quickly for us to figure out what is the best way to communicate all of this complex information that sort of underlies the use of genetics for health conditions and for treatment and prevention. So that's kind of the background of what I study. And the bottom line as to why, what VR adds to all of this is that these technologies are still emerging. And so we want to be able to predict something about what's going to happen in the future when these technologies roll out into the clinic. So I am looking at a preview of my next slide, and I'm realizing that I just pulled up the wrong talk, which is highly embarrassing. But if you can give me a minute, I will pull up the right one. Sorry about that.
No problem.
I'm not sure how I did that. Let's see. Okay. Oops. All right. So sorry, but I decided to go a slightly different way with this than I had. So just give me 1 second and I'll get it all up. Okay. And okay, so you should see my slides again. Great. Okay, so obviously we'll skip over the parts we've already done. Okay, so basically where we're going with this is to try to sort of research the medical care of the future in a way. So we can use the information that we get from VR sort of simulations of these healthcare experiences to create evidence-based approaches and recommendations for how we should start to roll out some of these genetic products when they're available. Okay, so I think it might actually be useful now to sort of take a step back and think about how we integrate VR into this research process before we really think about and see how it can be most useful. So for all of us who are researchers, which is probably everybody here, obviously we start our projects with a research question, something we want to answer. So for an example, something that we might study in my group is, should we give patients information about their genomic predisposition or risk of type 2 diabetes in the future? So to a lot of people, that sounds like a really easy question. You know, knowledge is power. Of course, we would want that information. But on the other hand, knowing your genetic risk doesn't actually really change anything about the medical or the health recommendations that would be made for you right now. Also, what if patients become fatalistic about this risk? And what if this reduces their prevention behavior? So it turns out that these communication questions actually aren't always all that simple, and we do need data to inform our stance on sort of how we should be giving out this information and how we should be communicating it. So obviously we need to design research studies to answer these questions. Obviously the gold standard is typically to do an experiment, a randomized controlled trial. So for example, to randomly assign some people to receive genetic information about diabetes, while others receive some other type of information. So if we think about what this would look like in the real clinic setting, we could go into a real medical visit with a real patient, and we could ask a healthcare provider to communicate to a randomly chosen half of their patients, as opposed to some other information they might give. Now, this is a little bit hard to ask of a doctor during the very, very short window they have with their patients. At least in the US, this tends to be about 10 to 15 minutes. Also, the clinical visit is not particularly well controlled. So when in the visit will the doctor bring this up? What's going to come before? What's going to come after? And most importantly, it actually may not be the right choice to talk about this or to give this information to the patient during any given clinical encounter. And then we also have other sorts of variation in the medical visit that reduces our experimental control. So some people bring a family member with them. Most people end up having multiple health conditions they want to talk about. You know, they call us the hand on the door phenomenon. As soon as the doctor gets the hand on the door, oh, doctor, one more thing, right? And so these medical visits are really variable. Okay, but let's say we do this in the clinical encounter. Then we want to collect data to figure out whether the information this physician is giving actually causes differences in patient response. So typically we video record the encounter, code the conversation. And so there are a lot of studies done this way, and this can be a really worthwhile thing to do, but there's obviously a lot of downsides to it. So completely unsurprisingly, we have opted to study these questions in a VR-based clinical encounter. So here we're precisely randomizing provider communication. We just change the sound files, you know, that the virtual human is going to say. We can randomize provider characteristics. So we can study the influence of characteristics like provider race, body size, et cetera, without changing anything else about the interaction. And we can make sure that all of these visits are uniform. So they unfold, obviously, just the way that we've programmed them to, really. And then we automatically capture all of our novel behavioral and physical movement behaviors, like eye contact, and so on. And then, of course, what's really important for this context is that these medical conversations that we're studying here can be about anything. So we can research how patients are responding to these genomic concepts, maybe even results from these genomic tests that real doctors don't actually use yet. So it's not like we could even go into a clinical scenario and watch it unfold, because this is not actually occurring. So in terms of what it looks like in the lab, in practice, I'm going to use the example of a study we conducted to look at the basic influence of having a virtual physician present information about genomic factors in obesity risk to patients. And so we looked at this versus lifestyle information, which is much more standard, kind of a standard of care. And we were interested to see whether talking about genetic influences on weight would influence patients' trust in the provider, and also influence patient perception that the provider was treating the patient fairly. We were also interested in patients' motivation to enact healthy behaviors as well. So what this looks like, typically we have participants fill out a questionnaire about themselves, their belief, their background, and so on. We bring them into the lab. We introduce them to the VR setting. Sometimes we give them information to consider during their visit. And then we put them into VR for this simulated conversation with the virtual provider. So typically this virtual provider is asking patients questions, and the patient answers them. The virtual provider is programmed to respond in a way that sort of fits within the universe of everything that we think that this virtual patient might say, or any virtual patient might say. I'm sorry, I'm saying virtual patient. It is a human patient and a virtual provider. So the virtual provider is programmed to respond to really sort of anything that the patient, the human, might say, but it is all pre-programmed. So we have chosen not to use AI to power our virtual provider. mostly because we want every participant in the study to have the exact same experience and the exact same information. Although this is definitely a design choice that we've made and one that we'll have to keep making as we think about going forward. Sometimes we collect follow-up data in VR. Sometimes we'll ask the participant to report on elements of the visit, and then we'll obviously survey people, ask them things like their thoughts about the visit, their experiences, their future plans. All right. Oh, and the one thing I guess I forgot to describe is that while they're in that visit, we are also collecting all the data, and I've put some examples here of the spatial temporal data that we collect, and I'll show you an example of how we use that in just a bit. Okay, so back to the study I was describing. So when we looked at patients who had received genomic versus lifestyle information about weight and obesity, we got the findings I'm showing you here, which are a little bit complex, but basically they suggested that future clinical interactions involving genomic information can improve the patient-provider relationship. And they can do this by making patients who themselves have overweight or have obesity feel less blamed and less discriminated against. And through this, we can lead to cognitions or thoughts that are associated with healthier lifestyle behavior. Okay, but obviously we don't want to stop here. One of the really important questions we want to ask is for whom? You know, is genetic information useful for everyone and in what contexts? So here's an example of another project we've done to look at this. This work really capitalized on the ability of VR to change characteristics of the individual. So the question we asked here was whether racial concordance or racial match between patient and provider influence African-American adults' perception of their cancer risk in response to the genomic information that the doctor's providing. It's a little bit of an older study. You can sort of tell by the avatars we used, but we manipulated the doctor's apparent race while keeping all of the information the doctor gave, as well as his voice and everything else about him, the same. So these African-American adults who came into the study received information from either the racially concordant or Black doctor or the racially discordant or white doctor. And what this study really allowed us to do that really wasn't possible in the past was to separate the apparent race of the doctor from everything else, you know, separate it from all of the things that might actually influence the outcome of a racially concordant versus a racially discordant doctor visit. And this is something that's been really, really difficult to tease apart. So the results that we got were actually pretty striking. We're looking here at participants' perception of their own risk for lung cancer following this virtual visit, but we're not just looking at their risk perception. What we're actually looking at is the difference between the objective risk that the doctor gave them and their post-visit perception of their risk. So here, higher numbers are actually more inaccurate because there's more difference. So what we saw was that those who saw the racially discordant provider on the right-hand side of the graph were actually much more inaccurate about their risk for cancer after the visit. And this was especially true among smokers for whom this risk about lung cancer is more important. You know, and so here we're seeing that, you know, even just the visual cues of the provider race can be really impactful on the way that we're processing health information. So we can go back then to this question of providing genomic information related to obesity. We went back to look at what factors might actually sort of tip the balance, what factors would moderate patient response to be more positive versus more negative when a doctor talks about genetics and genomics. I'm not going to go through the whole model and the theory here, but there are a lot of reasons that giving information about genetics or genomics of weight could end up being more positive versus more negative from a patient perspective. So in this study, we looked at for whom and in what context genomic information would be most helpful. And the two factors we looked at in this study were patient race. And in this case, participants were always interacting with this white male provider that I'm showing you here, and also patient emotional state. So looking at patients' reports of the clinical discussion, we saw an interaction. So among our Black participants on the left, genomic information in that light blue color had more negative consequences than behavioral information. We did not see that pattern among our white participants on the right. We actually see somewhat of a flip of that pattern. So it looks like it's actually our white patients or white participants who are reacting positively to that genomic information. We also did some behavioral assessment looking at their physical movement behavior during this interaction. This is obviously a lot more complicated, but what we were looking at here is interpersonal distance. So here they were seated, so it was a lean in versus a lean away from our virtual doctor. And we're looking at this sort of as an engagement metric. And there are a lot of groups here and a lot of curves. The ones that I want to direct your attention to were the two groups who actually started moving away from the doctor as he was talking about causal factors in weight. And those were our Black participants who received genetic information and our white participants who received behavioral information. But as you might have noted, this only happened when these participants were also in an angry state. Okay, so this is starting to demonstrate that we're going to have to pay attention to these contextual variables that are really common in clinical interactions, but that reflect or are associated with really important life experiences that influence patient response to this information. And I'll also point out that here our behavioral data in the VR is giving us a window into these reactions that we might not see if we only just ask people about what they thought or about what they felt. So that is kind of on the patient side. We don't only simulate doctors in the medical interactions, we also use VR to simulate patients. So that way we can test healthcare providers' responses to genomic information and to patient variation as well. And so I'm showing you here actually one of the very first studies we did in this vein, where we brought medical students into the lab. And we gave these medical students information about genomic factors in obesity or lifestyle factors in obesity. Or we gave them an article that had nothing to do with obesity at all. It was about chronic daily headaches. And we gave them this information in a way that is really typical in med school, which is through a journal article. Okay, then we put them in interaction with this virtual patient. And here again, she was the same in every single way except for her apparent weight. And then in this interaction, they learned about the patient's health concerns, including a rash on her hand and some knee pain and some shortness of breath. Okay, so here's what we saw. After the visit, we measured the extent to which medical students stereotyped the patient due to her weight. And we found that the patient with obesity was stereotyped much more than the lean patient, which is unsurprising based on the literature and the things we know about weight stigma. But it's also important to remember here that the lean versus the obese patient said and did the exact same things, had the same medical record. So the only real difference is the apparent weight of the patient. However, the negative stereotyping was reduced significantly when the medical students read about genetic risk factors in weight. We saw something kind of similar when we looked at visual contact. So visual contact is gaze. In VR, it's basically a proxy for eye contact, which we know is really important in the clinical interaction. So here, our medical students made less visual contact with the obese version of the patient than the lean patient. And reading about the genetic information actually restored this visual contact. So here VR gave us a setting where we could test the influence of this information in a real-ish clinical context, a psychologically realistic context, and look at really real influences on medical student behavior. And then these scenarios also gave us an opportunity to examine sort of the patterns of real medical decision-making that would happen. And so in this case, we looked at several aspects of recommendations, including follow-up and consultations that could be part of the primary care for this patient. And what we found was that recommendations for these behavioral health follow-ups were recommended at really high rates for the virtual patient with obesity and who got the control information, and the virtual patient with obesity who got the behavioral information. Those who got the genomic information actually showed rates of recommendation that were a lot lower. And so this is starting to suggest that, considering genetics and genomics here might have a downside when it comes to decisions made for the patient's care. But this is a really, really understudied area. It's an area where we're continuing to look. So in more recent work, actually really recent work, we've conducted another version of the study where we've changed now the source of the genetic information that this med student is receiving to the clinical interaction itself. So the patient brings in genetic risk information about herself. She brings in a report that you might get from one of these internet-based companies. And then we also varied here the race of the patient to investigate first how medical students are even going to start to use this genetic information. And then whether the information is influencing medical student treatment of the patient differentially, depending upon her apparent race. Now, we started running the study last year, but unfortunately got interrupted by COVID-19. So we've now decided to go ahead and take what we've learned from the 80-some medical students who did participate in the study so far and sort of treat it as a big pilot study to figure out what we can learn before moving on to our next work. So we are in the process of analyzing data right now, and I didn't bring any to share with you today, but I will tell you that we are finding that this genetic information is being differently considered by medical students depending upon patient race, which was something we had sort of hoped not to find, but will be an important area for future research. And then in this vein, and just one other thing I want to point out that we're doing is another project where, again, we've sort of recently wrapped up data collection, but we're using this simulation paradigm more as an evaluation tool. So we're doing this with collaboration with colleagues at Samuel Merritt University and University of San Francisco. And we've used our virtual patients to evaluate the efficacy of a genetics-oriented learning module. So there was a learning module about pharmacogenetics, which is the use of genetic information to make decisions about drugs and what sort of drugs to prescribe. And this module was integrated into the nursing curriculum in a randomized way. So the nursing classes were randomly assigned to receive the module or not to receive the module. And then at the end of the semester, we had them interact with one of these virtual patients so that we can investigate whether and how they applied this knowledge from the educational intervention in interaction with the virtual patient. And further, as we did this, we also, again, varied the race of the virtual patient to determine whether that information was applied consistently depending upon patient race. So another case where I unfortunately didn't bring data to share today, and I actually don't know what the data hold, but really looking forward to having findings to share pretty soon on this one. So that's kind of all related to the clinical healthcare environment, which I hope is pretty familiar to most of us, hopefully not too familiar. But that makes a lot of sense to us as a context where we'd be talking about genetics and genomics. But genomics is actually also becoming pretty important in communities. And so we've thought about some examples of this already, such as these direct-to-consumer companies where you can order tests about your health or your family tree or just for fun. Public health genomics, is also a thing. And then there are also these large-scale efforts to try and collect sort of big data to figure out on a more of a population level, how can we personalize and tailor health recommendations and treatments and so on. But even if you've never heard of any of that, you don't order genetic tests, you don't engage in any of this, we're still all exposed to information through the media about genetic and genomic factors in health. And these types of more sort of incidental exposure to genomics can actually be really influential on the way we think about our bodies and our health. So it's important to study how this information affects community members sort of going on about their daily lives. And so that's another area that I've been studying using VR. So for a lot of this work, we focused pretty squarely on parental feeding behavior. So the foods that parents choose for their children and how this varies depending upon the genetics and the genomics concepts that we expose parents to. And for this, we developed this VR buffet. I'm showing you a couple of images here. Basically, we made sure this buffet was filled with foods that kids like and that parents often choose to feed them. I should say that US kids like. I know it's variable. And we're actually trying to work on a new version of this buffet to make it a little bit more easy to switch foods in and out and make it more usable by other folks. But the idea here is that parents can move around VR naturalistically and choose for food servings for their child. And then from the behavior, we love the data. We can measure exactly what the nutrient profile is of the foods that were chosen. So we get things like calories that were chosen, the amount of sugar and fat, and whether there was a sweetened beverage or an unsweetened beverage, and so on. And then we also get a lot of process measure. So measure about whether parents change choices. We actually let them put food back on the buffet, which is hopefully the only time they'll ever do it. But we want them to be able to end up what they ultimately want to choose. So we can study that. We study the order of food choices, the timing, and so on. And I'll show you a couple examples of that. But the question that I think most people sort of get to asking themselves right around now is, how do we know that food choice behavior in VR is relevant for our real world behavior? So we conducted a validation test of this. So here we wanted to check this assumption or this premise that measuring food choice in VR is going to tell us something useful about real life behavior. So here we compared parent choices for the child in VR to real life choices. In the trial, we have parents choosing a single food at this point. They're choosing pasta with tomato sauce for their child. We have them choose it in VR, which we see here on the left. Then we give them a distractor. It turns out that playing Tetris, the game Tetris, is a really good distractor. Really helps to clear out those visual memory systems. So we have these parents play Tetris for a few minutes, and then we have them choose from an identical setup in the real world. This is actually counterbalanced. So some parents do virtual pasta first and some do real pasta first. But basically we went through, every pain we could go through to make sure that pasta was as similar in real life as it was, as it could be to the virtual. And down at the bottom here, we can see a picture of the metabolic kitchen at the NIH. They found this to be a really fun and interesting project to take on, but they had to make sort of the exact same dish of pasta for every participant in this study. So we had them do that, and then we had them go through the full buffet, make a full meal for their child, and then self-report assessment at the end. So what we found at the end of the day was a nice high correlation. So the people who were sort of high servers in VR were high servers in real life, and those who chose small amounts of food in VR chose smaller amounts in reality as well. We also checked to make sure we saw the patterns that we expected and that we regularly see in real food serving. And so as we expected to see, parents chose more food for boys. They also chose more food for older children. So at the end of the day, what this means to us is that the outcome measures that we pull from the VR buffet, can actually say something about what parents would do with real food in the real world. So in terms of how we've actually used this and applied it for research, we've used it mostly as a tool to evaluate changes in parent behavior after receiving information about their children's genomic risk for disease. So in one example, which I'm showing you here, we found that providing mothers with genomics-based obesity risk information for their child was associated with choosing fewer calories for that child from the VR buffet. So this work also was the first to sort of demonstrate that this VR buffet was sensitive enough of a measure to get at some of these intervention effects. Oh, there it is. So in that darker orange bar with the star, it sort of corresponds with the risk message I'm showing you here. So those parents were serving fewer calories in the VR buffet. And then more recently, we've used the VR buffet to try and disentangle and figure out what kind of genomics information is going to be associated with better child feeding outcomes. Genomics is really complex. The gene environment interaction is very complex, and sort of figuring out, what do people need to know, what parts of it are best to communicate, that is still a moving target. So here we tried to communicate to parents about various ways they might think about their children's obesity risk in later life. And among the conditions were parents receiving information really about genetics alone and how the predisposition for overweight and obesity can be passed down from parents to children. And then on the right, it's more about how genes in the environment interact with one another to confer risk for obesity in later life. And so the primary outcome here was, again, food choice behavior of the parents in the VR buffet. We see that parents who receive the gene environment message, which is in red here, or reddish orange perhaps, they chose about 65 fewer calories for their child than those who got the genes only message. And interestingly, we also asked the parents a week later what their child had eaten in the last week following the lab visit. And we see similar outcomes on some of the types of food that the child's eaten, sort of less healthy foods, such as junk food and fatty meat. So this increases our confidence in our effect, but also helps us to compare our VR results with real world feeding outcomes again. So overall, what we're getting here is a sense that these gene environment interaction concepts can have an important and beneficial influence on health behaviors, as we're measuring in VR and as we're measuring them in real life. And so we're also getting feedback about the efficacy of different communication approaches to look at this concept. But this work, the question that this kind of work raises for us is, how should we communicate this gene environment interaction when we can't really force people to sit and listen to a long PowerPoint presentation, which is really how we gave them the information here. And that's not something that's going to work in the clinic. It's not something that's going to work in a public health setting. So can we create a way to educate people about gene environment interaction that will lead to even more engagement, more healthy behavior? I mean, that would be great. And so that's where we're headed. So this is us kind of moving into the world of sort of trying to build tools that might be useful outside of a research context. So here we're in the midst of creating a VR-based health education tool to communicate how genes and environmental factors interact to confer risk to create behavior. So through a lot of the other research we've done, some of which I haven't shown you, we've also been really interested in the concept of how genes influence your eating behavior. So a lot of people don't think about it this way, but there are a lot of genetic factors in play in terms of the preferences people have, whether they eat or not eat in certain situations and so on. So genetics are really active in terms of, in the context of eating behavior. So we decided this would be a really good context to use because it's nice and grounded and it makes sense to people. And so we're trying to create a narrative and experiential embodied situation where people can learn about the influence of genes and environment on eating behavior. So we're learning from all these great literatures on narrative storytelling and empathy and embodiment to create this. This is something we're working on iteratively. We're to create this environment and sort of testing it along the line at every phase. So we're only in the very beginning stages of this, but it's I think a really exciting direction for us. So just to go over a couple more things, before we even get to this, creating this tool and employing this tool, there are still a lot of really interesting ways to explore the data that have come out of these virtual buffet studies. Once we sort of look at our main outcomes of calories or whatever they are, we often find that we have just scratched the very tip of the iceberg of what's gone on in those studies. So we're working to evaluate the data that we collect in VR to answer some other questions about the psychological processes that are related to healthy behavior. So the example I'm showing you here, we use some of that fine-grained process data about how foods are chosen to understand how these sort of micro behaviors that make up the food choice process, how these unfold over time. Because we can think about choosing food as like one big process, right? You go into the buffet, you choose the food, but that's not really how it works, right? We go and make, tens, maybe hundreds of decisions as we walk around and ultimately create that meal. So we used a modeling technique called relational event modeling to understand the various influences on these mothers' choices over time during the food choice process. And through the analysis, we were able to see the influences of sort of the built environment, so of what the cafeteria looked like, how it was built, where the foods were located. We were able to see influences of things like social norms, so that people very much got their dessert last because that's sort of what we normatively do. And then we were also able to see some of how these paths diverged based on the intervention that they were given. And I'm just showing you a little graph of that. So basically, we're able to see how the different intervention categories in that first buffet study I showed you, how they actually caused the meals that the mothers were choosing to sort of diverge over time, and how that sort of played out, in the end with the differential calories. So this has been a really interesting avenue for looking at the VR data over time. And then another way we've looked at the data are sort of over space, if you will. So we've looked at the physical body movement of our users and what that can tell us about the psychological process in the buffet. And we'll see if this works. If it's working, you should be able to see a little green path on the ground. And what we're looking at here is an overhead view of our virtual buffet. This is not the way that users ever see it, but this is the path that somebody is taking as they walk around the buffet to choose foods. And so we can look at those paths and kind of figure out, whether there's anything that this path can tell us about what's happening. And so we looked at what's called the path tortuosity of users, and this is the straightness versus the curviness of the paths that were used to walk around the buffet. And what we found was that parents who had more tortuous, more sort of curvy paths felt less guilty about child feeding after the buffet. So this is likely because they felt that they had sort of tried harder to make the meal by walking around more and, and so on. I'll just add that this was also true even after controlling for things like the actual healthfulness of the food choices that the parent made, the unique number of foods they chose and time, and some of the things that, we at first thought, well, maybe it's just, how long they spent, or maybe it's, just, things like that. So we actually controlled for all of those things and it still held. So it's been really interesting to see what these unobtrusive and implicit measures could tell us about users' thought process. And so we're in the midst of doing a little bit more digging into some of the data we've collected over the years to see what else we can unearth in that manner. So I'm going to actually go ahead and wind it up here. Just sort of pointing out that over the years, this lab that I lead has been around now almost 15 years. So this is, work going on over kind of a long time. But throughout this span and all the changes that have gone on in VR, but also in genetics and in genomics, VR has really proven itself to be an important tool to investigate psychological process that underlies people's behavior. And we're still working in this really rapidly moving scientific and medical area that's been benefiting from VR. And I think it's really helping us to better envision sort of where we're going, sort of study the future of healthcare, and hopefully be able to mold some of those genetic and genomic interventions as they're starting to roll out and get translated. And so I will just put up this last slide to acknowledge all the people who've been involved in this work. And if there are questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thanks so much, Susan. That was really great. Does anybody have any questions directly? I can kick off a question that I had actually about obviously the research that you're doing